taken to court because there's for people who are large developers, it can be a fair amount of money that they could be contributing, so it's worth their while to actually appeal as much as they can. So I would anticipate that that's actually a likely scenario if the council proceeds with this. It's not necessarily saying you shouldn't do it. It's just accepting that given the RMA system that we've got, that's probably would continue on into Environment Court. That's my opinion.
It's part of the analysis, and sorry if I've missed it in the detail, we've got a lot. There's a lot here. But as part of the analysis really about how much of a difference will this make to the numbers of affordable housing versus what we would have anyway? What we would get anyway from upzoning. Councillor has been, the biggest proponent probably of us upzoning in this way. So, do we know how much of a difference this will make actually for numbers of affordable homes?
We have a general idea because we do have numbers from Councillor and we do have estimates from what our community housing providers are doing through our housing team. So that information is in the social housing impact assessment, I think, which is online, and I can send you that link as well.
Thank you very much for answering all my questions.
Thank you. Councillor Conti, do you have a question on the same topic? Okay, so Tam's just suggested we group them. So Councillor Foon and Councillor Paul.
Kia ora, and I might not have my question completely lined up, but so officers are now recommending after the submission process that we limit the assisted housing to just the city centre. And can you just explain the difference again in what we had originally and what you're proposing now, and what was the reason for that? And do officers, I guess, and my question is around, wouldn't it be better in the same way that this might push it out to the regions to not be pushing it into the suburbs, if you like, development opportunities? Is there a risk of that?
So the draft proposed plan that's going to still has the contributions coming from the same areas as in the as I presented to you previously. So there hasn't been any reduction in that area. It's still focused on our growth areas, so areas where we've significantly increased building height and greenfield areas.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Paul. Now I want to ask a question, just as the person who suggested this. I want to know if we're charging people enough, because what I'm worried about is that the $15,000 might look much more preferable to the 10%, which is what would be awesome if they could do that. Could you just provide a response to that question?
Interestingly, this was raised by our peer reviewer as well, who had the same point. In my discussions with him, I pointed out that I expect that the financial contribution and the contribution of 10% is actually likely to be more comparable than we expect, because a developer would be unlikely to just give that 10%. What's more likely is that they would do some sort of partnership with council even, but if not council, then definitely a community housing provider who could get a loan from a bank and maybe buy it at 50% of the overall market price, and then be able to charge a subsidised leasehold payment or rental payment for assisted housing. So I mean, while it's possible that developers could be kind-hearted and give 10% free to a community housing provider, I think it's more likely to be a subsidised payment. So that. In fact, the peer reviewer said it's probably be more likely to be around a 30% discount, given examples in Australia that he's familiar with, which puts it closer to that 115,000. But I agree, it will depending on developer, whether they would prefer to have the assisted housing as part of the development or just provide the financial contribution.
Great. Okay, thank you. Right, Councillor Conda, you've been waiting, and then Councillor Young.
Thank you, Chair. I guess I want to start with a question about the SNAs. And, one of the big, concerns that owners of property who have these SNAs have been raising, I think, is that they might want to subdivide in the future. They've got extra land and they want to subdivide, they're residentially zoned, and that this is going to make it really difficult for them to do that. Can you talk us through, what the rules around subdividing a land that has SNAs on it will look like compared to what it might look like right now? How much more restrictive is it going to be? And will people still be able to subdivide land if it's got an SNA on it and then have a house built?
Yep, I can talk to that. So basically any subdivision needs a resource consent, so that's part of the plan now. So again, when you're subdividing, you need to apply for resource consent. And similar to if you were just building the second house, the assessment will be very similar. In other words, it's not really the subdivision that's the issue, it's where you're building the second house. So the amount of vegetation that's required to provide for a second house will be what's considered. So yes, you can still subdivide, you can go through the process of applying, but the process would want to have an assessment of how much vegetation is being removed, what is the quality of that vegetation being removed, and if the conclusion is that it's manageable and the effects on biodiversity are acceptable, then you can still get consent.
And I guess the question for people will be then what happens to them if the view is that it's not manageable or that there's significant loss, then what are the options for them?
So if you can't show that you can manage or mitigate the effects, then if you like, the bottom test is what's called compensation or offsetting. So in that case, someone would have to demonstrate that they can go and plant new biodiversity on another site that would effectively be equal to the loss on that site. But effectively, under their current approach, that's the least favourable. What we want to do is manage the biodiversity we have and try and minimise the effects on that. So there's a hierarchy of approach from managing to offsetting. If that can't be done, then yes, that could be declined, that subdivision. But the starting point is to work through that process to see if a subdivision is possible that allows a house to be built alongside minimising the effects on the biodiversity.
Thank you. And then I just had a question about wind. Is that all right, Chair, or do you want to
No, you go for it.
Okay. Just that in one of the submissions that was in one of my forums was from the Property Council, and they raised concerns about the wind test and that the wind test adds sort of 6 to 9 months onto a development. And they were particularly concerned about this in Te Aro because basically every new building in Te Aro was going to need a wind test. Have we, can you talk me through, this is a really technical area, can you talk me through how we responded to those concerns, please?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora, Councillor. And I have got a response coming to you today on that. So we did look at the Property Council's suggestion to raise it to the minimum height. But ultimately, I've been working with wind experts, WSP in particular, and they feel that 20 metres is a comfortable level that they're prepared to have the trigger level at, and they're not prepared to raise it in terms of extent of effects. So I do appreciate that it's a little bit of a, I guess, touch point. But we have introduced as part of the draft plan and proposed plan that there's 2 types of assessment. So there's a qualitative assessment, which is kind of a desktop, and it takes less time and is more cost efficient. And then there's a quantitative, which is the wind tunnel test. So in areas like the city centre, normally it would, the first port of call would be a quantitative because of the scale of effects and scale of development, but it's up to the discretion of a consent planner that they might actually deem that a qualitative assessment might be appropriate given the environment, given the proposed development, and any wind mitigation has been taken into that. Whereas in our local centres, the first port of call is that qualitative wind assessment.
Okay, so if a developer was going through that and they kind of wanted to try and get a qualitative rather than a quantitative assessment, is that something that would come up in a pre-app? Do they have to know that to ask for it? Is this going to be something that people are aware of?
Yeah, so we've put a lot in the proposed plan in terms up front in the introduction. We've also got an appendix, and we've done hopefully a clearer job of relating to our wind best practice guidance. So what we've tried to do in this guidance document is really, I guess, make it much more efficient for developers, but also lay people to understand what are quite technical rules. And also it'll be part of the pre-app discussion around wind effects, and also have they gone through this design guide? Have they tried to show that they're trying to mitigate wind impacts on the surrounding environment? So it's very much a conversation with the consent planner first and foremost.
Thank you. I do have a question about stormwater retention on site, but Councillor Foon might want to ask that one because she's been leading the amendment. Laurie, do you want to take that one when it's your turn?
Yes.
Sure. Then I'm done. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks for asking about wind. Councillor Young.
I just wonder if someone could tell me what is affordable.
Yeah, everyone's spending a lot of time on that one.
I can talk to that. Yeah, sure. So in the district plan, in terms of being defined as assisted housing, one of the categories is affordable, and that's based on using our Wellington housing affordability model to look at what's affordable for a low to middle income household within Wellington City for a particular housing type. So, for example, for a 2-bedroom place, you'd look at the household's income up to low to middle, and then take into account their expenses, and then how much should be left over for rent or for a mortgage, and if that's above or below. It's I don't have that off the top of my head, but it does vary depending on the household size and the size of the place.
Have you got your microphone on? Thank you.
That's one end of the equation. That's what they can afford. But then what is affordable? Because if you look at the land prices around Wellington, I mean, I was looking at that townhouse development in Pyrie Street where 3 villas were knocked down, and they've got 12 or 14 townhouses, but each one is $1.5 million. So, I mean, is that affordable? Because it doesn't seem that affordable.
Well, for our assisted housing chapter, that wouldn't be classed as affordable.
I'm not talking just about assisted housing. I'm just talking about affordable housing
more generally.
For our kids, for example, who've got reasonable jobs, that kind of thing. What's affordable?
I think this is something we're trying to. Moana might want to chip in here, but it's something that we're trying to do with the whole district plan.
So that's why when we developed the Wellington Housing Affordability Model, it was trying to get away from this idea that there's $1 figure that's affordable and everything above it is not affordable, everything below it is. It was saying actually when you build something and it comes at a price point, what is the salary range that it is affordable for? And from that we will then be able to make a call on whether that's enough within the district plan rules. But it allows us to actually move forward and not get stuck on that one question of there has to be a dollar figure. And what we're saying is we're looking at low to medium income people.
And so, Moana, what is low to medium income? What are the brackets?
I'm not sure what the median income is at the moment, but we'd use government figures for that.
No, it's just, it's interesting to actually have an idea of what the amount actually is, because if you look at the housing market, they're still crazy figures.
And that's why I think the Wellington Housing Affordability Model was very novel in New Zealand, and that it actually looked at what someone's income was, what we called the basket of goods. So, and then you can have the basket of goods can be from very basic through to more substantial. When you have the baskets of goods, what do you have left over in order to service some mortgages? And it turned that conversation entirely around, which I think was helpful.
Okay, lovely. Councillor Fitzsimons.
Thanks so much. I'm just interested in the assisted housing and the option of almost like a penalty instead of building assisted housing. Where does that money go?
The money from the financial contributions?
Yeah.
So the proposal is that that would go into a fund coordinated by council, which would be a contestable fund where applicants can apply to it for either grants or loans for assisted housing projects. And then there would be the actual delivery of that money or to the successful applicants would be done through an independent group, but the actual criteria would likely be set through council in accordance with our housing strategy and housing action plan. So that's what's being proposed at the moment. A similar fund is currently happening through Nelson City. So we're using there as a bit of a prototype.
And where can I read more about that?
I can provide you some papers from Nelson and some slides.
I mean our proposal, the proposal that you've put forward.
Is that the paper?
So, Councillor Fitzsimons, we've spent quite a lot of time in the working group, but I appreciate you have been coming to the meeting. So whatever you can find from the slides, maybe, Andrew?
Yes, I can do that.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
So there's no actual decision on that, though, is there?
Yeah, it's in the district plan. Yep.
So that's what I want to know, the page. So I know there's assisted housing. I've looked at that, but I can't find the fund that arises out of the penalty payment. Is that on the same section?
There is a method in there which is quite general, but the intent for the district plan being a regulatory document is to kind of receive the money, but then the actual how the money is applied to specific projects becomes an operational decision within council rather than a regulatory decision. So that level of detail is not going to be in the district plan. It's more just.
So what Councillor Pennant just said in terms of it's in the district plan, the fund isn't. The detail about the way the fund is established and the funding of it is. Is that correct?
In brief, that the fund the money received will have to be used for assisted housing within Wellington City Council. A few high-level criteria is in a method there.
But that's an operational issue which you'll deal with out of the district plan. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Councillor Fitzsimons, so that will come last or later because what we've got to do is firstly test the policy and the rule requiring it. So once it's been through the process, we would then be developing alongside if it is successful an implementation plan.
That's correct.
Thank you. My next question is around removal from the heritage list, and I just want to check that it is simply a resolution on Thursday to remove a building from the heritage list. And I've looked on the council website and looked at the section, and that does seem to be what it's saying, but I just want to double check. And I think, Liam, you'll know the particular instance I'm looking at.
Kia ora, councillors. So that is correct, that a decision to notify the proposed district plan with the heritage list or without certain buildings on it means that it has been removed. The operative district plan heritage list will continue to have effect until decisions are made on the proposed district plan heritage list and provisions. So things are still listed for an interim period, even if they have been removed from the proposed district plan heritage list.
Okay, cool. And am I right in thinking that an individual can also bring that to the hearings process or apply separately?
So in the submissions process on the proposed district plan, anyone can make a nomination saying, hey, I think there's this pretty cool building and it may have heritage value. To be eligible for entry onto the heritage list, we would need to complete a detailed heritage assessment that gives us.
I'm talking about the opposite, really, removal. In that
yes,
process.
Yep. In that instance, it would be the hearings panel that would consider the removal of any building and make a recommendation to council, noting that heritage is being dealt with through the ISPP process.
Oh, and just Liam, just checking, when did Councillor Foon and I need to use this forum to seek advice on that email, or will you come to us separately on that?
I'll come to you separately because I've just forwarded it to the heritage team today, and also Councillor Fitzsimons to our earthquake prone building list team as well, who are managing the Building Act stuff. Okay, so I'll provide that separately.
No, that's good. Just my final question is sort of looking at the design guides and the documents. Is there anything more we can be doing to help people kind of navigate what is quite a complicated, difficult process in terms of their understanding? And I'm particularly thinking of people that want to densify but don't have experience in, these processes. They're not the sort of big town developers, but they do want to put some more housing on their property, or they want to do smaller intensive developments. I just think it's like you planners live this and breathe this, but for mum and dad developers, is there anything more we could be doing to help it not be so difficult and complicated?
So there are a few things that people can do and do now to make this process simpler. So as a frontline service, we have a planning help desk that can field queries of varieties of different scales of development, and in the first instance they can provide advice. People also have the opportunity to engage a consultant resource management planner who can provide expert advice on how to get things done and how to navigate a district plan. And we recognise that a district plan is inherently a technical document, and you do sometimes need a bit of help to navigate your way through. So consultant planners can provide advice as well. The other option is through the pre-application process with resource consent planners. People can come in and have a conversation around what are the relevant district plan matters that are at play, and they can provide useful assistance. Also, as we notify the proposed district plan, we will have some frequently asked questions and some fact sheets available for people, especially around the medium density residential standards, how they all work, and how the proposed district plan and an operative plan sit with one another.
Cool, thank you. And my final question was really, I'm a little bit worried that we don't have the developer capacity to deliver the density we need. And I'm just wondering if there's any reflections on that. And I know it's an issue over a long time, so it's not like it needs to be resolved, tomorrow. But what is there any mechanisms the council could adopt to help de-risk or help incentivise density among a developer community that's, in Wellington at present, not that big? And I compare it to what's happening in particularly Auckland and Christchurch, where there is, I think, that capacity. Or is that just really in their hands and pretty tricky for us to incentivise or intervene in?
Using a sorry, John. Using a district plan to incentivise developers is a complex task. Essentially, the biggest determinant for a developer is the certainty of development. So the more uncertain the process, the higher the holding costs and processing costs become. So having a clear district plan is probably the best thing we can do for that process. In terms of building that longer term capacity, it's also dependent on clarification of other legislation, particularly the earthquake prone rules and the building code. And particularly in Wellington, in multi-unit developments, that's having quite an effect on our developer community.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Can I just add to that? One thing that I've found, the GFC, a lot of developers went bust. And as you say, there's quite a thin development market in terms of people. But what often happens is they cut their teeth on small infill developments and they move up from that. And I think, enabling a lot more intensification, and I suppose the medium density residential standards is an example of that, will enable people to start off small and maybe build up over time, but certainly is an issue at the moment.
Oh, thank you. That's a really helpful insight. Interesting.
Can I just ask a quick question, just following on from Fleur's, about removing heritage buildings? So, there's obviously quite a complex process to get it listed, but getting it delisted, is the evidential burden high too?
So council has discretion to include items on the heritage list, whether they meet the criteria. And if council decides that it wishes to remove an item, it could be taken off the list.
Okay, so it could just be done. It doesn't need a heritage assessment or anything like that?
No.
No, okay.
That is correct. However, it does need a degree of defensibility during the hearings process to endure.
Sorry, so if we took items off, then people could appeal through the commissioner process?
Yeah, so say the building owner was determined they wished to have a heritage building, they disagreed with the delisting, then that would be sorted out during that hearings process.
Okay.
And some of the things the commissioners would look at would be, well, what alternatives are being pro-offered that mean the heritage values of that place can be protected and maintained, albeit not through a heritage listing in the district plan. So perhaps there's a master plan or some other form of planning that ensures what's most important about those places is retained.
That is helpful. Right, Mayor Foster.
Thank you. Look, I've got 4 areas. I had 3. The heritage one was the 4th one. So just in terms of defending, if we decided we want to remove something, there are organisations who inevitably would be likely to have a crack at that, whether they're so likely to be owners. It's a matter of national importance in terms of the RMA. So we would have to be pretty well set up, assuming that somebody actually had a ping at us, wouldn't we?
Yes, we would. We'd have to have an alternative offered that showed that the matter of national importance or historic heritage and the values of that place can be protected through other means, if not a heritage listing in the district plan.
And if the purpose of delisting was to allow removal of the building, then that's going to be quite difficult, isn't it?
It might be considered problematic, yes.
Thank you for the understatement. Okay, second area question, bigger one. We've got about 76,000 properties which you think are feasibly enabled, so that takes into account the economic viability, the likelihood that individual properties will be developed, so you discount for those kind of things. Those numbers change dramatically with changing circumstances, don't they?
Indeed they do. So the report which outlines those figures, the property economics evaluation, shows that the difference between 1 year's economic conditions, 2021 to 2022, pretty much halves the realisable development capacity.
So the kind of things, and the two obvious things which have happened there is the cost of building building dwellings has increased enormously. I saw 20% a few weeks ago across the board, and secondly, interest rates rising. Those two would have really bitten very, very hard, wouldn't they?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. The other area I wanted to ask about was the work that's been done around outstanding and amenity landscapes. I just wanted to understand how it was Boffers that did the work, how they arrived at what they described as outstanding and amenity landscapes, and those ones which they decided weren't. And if I pick, so that the whole town belt is an amenity landscape, but the whole outer green belt is not. And I look at some of the bits which are included and think, yeah, Wrights Hill, for example, some of the bits, or Kaukau, some of the bits which are excluded, like Johnson's Hill. And I just sort of scratch my head and go, why?
Yeah, so my understanding is a lot comes down to the difference between the special amenity landscape and the outstanding natural features relate largely to the amount of human interaction or human development in those areas. So, for instance, the town belt, there is more human interaction and more development that is built there than our outstanding natural features and landscapes. So that's why, if you like, the special amenity landscapes are, if you like, a lower level because they are more developed, more changed than the outstanding natural features and landscapes.
Okay, so I was looking at the ones which have not made either, which are, for example, Johnson's Hill has nothing on it at all, not developed at all, but it doesn't make anything. And I'm just interested in what the rationale was. And there's also in the documentation this reference to us having to must have regard to the context of reserve management plans. And if you read the OGB management plan, it quite clearly talks about continuity and undeveloped. That's the kind of language which is in there. And I just wonder why. I still wonder why it is that Boffers have come up with that recommendation, which we've said we want to protect that whole area, and yet we've just left it relying on just ridgeline rules rather than amenity landscapes in that area.
Look, I'd have to go back and have a look at those reports for that particular site, but I would say I believe that's probably open space or rural with the ridgelines and hilltops over it, so there is still a high degree of protection from development, albeit maybe not to the same extent as an outstanding natural landscape. But yeah, I'd have to go back and particularly look at the reasoning why that site wasn't included.
Well, I was concerned, if I just finish that one off, I was concerned that John suggested that might be vulnerable.
The point there is ridgelines and hilltops doesn't meet the, I suppose, the classification of outstanding or special amenity landscapes. So that was the point I was making to you, that obviously we'll need to defend this position in front of the hearing commissioners. And so because it doesn't meet those criteria, it might be something that gets challenged.
Okay, so I come back to I would appreciate clarity about what those criteria are and why some make it and some don't, because that's not evident from the whatever I've read. Okay, and that takes me to the last question area I had at this stage, which was you mentioned that you were going to give us some advice from MFTE. Now, I don't know what that area of advice is, but I know that one piece of advice which is in train is around significant natural areas, which of course you've highlighted in the paper. But can you just give us any advice about if we were to not proceed with SNAs, how that might play out in terms of the advice we've been given by MFTE, and also we've been given contradictory advice. You've highlighted the forest and bird case, but other people have highlighted other cases where they are suggesting that the results have been different, forest and bird case.
So in terms of the advice from MFE, we haven't had specific advice, but I think what we're referring to is the exposure draft of the National Policy Statement on Indigenous.
Probably.
Yep, so that's just been released as of 2 weeks ago. That sets out now the direction from the government. It is a draft, so it's subject to obviously submission. But what the draft says is it will be gazetted before the end of the year. It says that councils must map SNAs in accordance with a consistent criteria. It says councils must do that as reasonably as possible, but there is a 5-year time frame to go through that process. So if it is gazetted this year, then councils have until 2027 to identify, map, and then include protection in the district plan. We've done a review of the draft MPS. We think we are well aligned with the direction it is setting. I know there's been some discussions about delaying while it comes out. It is now out in draft form. We've checked it. We're well aligned, and the direction is to implement it as soon as possible. The one area we're probably not aligned is it's probably taking a tougher approach than our approach. It sets what we call an avoid hierarchy. So essentially the starting point where you should be avoiding any development within an SNA, which is not aligned with our approach where we are enabling in some respects. So we do have some permitted rules, and we do have a criteria like we described with the subdivision that lets you go through and assess impacts. So we're probably a bit softer, to be honest, than the NPS, but I guess a benefit is that we're slightly ahead of the game because we have now mapped, we have provisions. So we're in a good position, we think, to include this in the proposed district plan now. And if we don't, obviously, then we are continuing to allow permitted removal of vegetation until what time we do give effect to that NPS. Does that answer your question?
It answered the first part. The second part was you mentioned the forest and bird case, but people who are opposed to SNA listing have mentioned other cases which they say have gone in the opposite direction. Could you just fill us in on that? Because that, of course, was none of those relate to exposure drafts of the biodiversity strategy, but to other legislation.
So the two that I'm aware of both relate to where forest and bird have challenged councils, one being New Plymouth, where they sought a declaration from the Environment Court because the council didn't include SNAs. The declaration was that the council should have included SNAs in their district plan. Liam might want to talk to that a little bit more than me. And the second one was Hutt City Council, where Forest and Bird took a challenge, but they didn't continue with the challenge. There were some discussions held between Forest and Bird and Hutt City, and I understand Hutt City did two things. They brought forward a plan change for protecting notable trees, so that gave Forest and Bird some comfort that there was some protection there. And of course, Hutt City are a bit behind us on their district plan review, and they have said they will include SNAs in their plan, following on from the direction that the NPS on Indigenous biodiversity set. So I'm sure that they will now pick up on that draft and carry that through into their review, which is a little bit behind where we're at. Those are the only 2 cases I'm aware of. Sorry, Mayor, I'm not sure of other ones.
That I presume is the ones which have been raised, so thank you for that.
Great. Deputy Mayor Free.
Thank you, and thank you to the officers who sat down and helped me look at the actual physical copies of the plan and put it all together with the maps. My question does relate a lot to that. Is there any way we can provide, in the final plan, a few more footnotes to avoid getting people upset? So, for example, I've just given the example of the Kilburnie bus barns, where a grey shaded area is just signalled as being up to 27 metres. But the reality of it is that the centres, metropolitan centres, rules would still apply. So it would actually be stepped back in for a lot of that area. And I just think some footnotes to avoid really upsetting communities and causing concern unnecessarily would be really helpful. Is there any ability to maybe look at it, put some consumer lens over that, and maybe add some more explanations?
So certainly using the E-plan is the best way to engage with the proposed district plan, where a lot of the hyperlinking between different chapters and the filtering of what's relevant to a particular site can be automatically done. So that's one of the best ways to do it. There are also cross-referencing sections that are at the front of relevant chapters, which tell people to, how about you go and have a look at the transport provisions if you're looking for bicycle parking requirements. So the E-plan resolves a lot of those issues with navigating it. And also our fact sheets will help people work their way through the plan as well as understand how to find different parts.
Thank you. That's helpful. I'm still going to persist on this a little bit because not everybody is going to look at it online. So the fact sheets are a good idea. Can we please include an example like the Kilburnie bus barns so that people can see that there's more to it than they might see just looking at a page? And the other question I've got is, where will people be able to access hard copies?
So when the proposed district plan is formally notified and any amendments are made to the text, we will have a hard copy in every library in the city, and there will also be the online version as well. So libraries as is usual practice.
Okay, and maps as well available in libraries?
There will be a selection of maps, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Paul.
Thanks for your mahi. Okay, mine kind of range in subject matter, so apologies. So I was wondering, in terms of zoning and stuff, is it possible to put like zones around like public housing or schools to like prevent certain activities like loan sharks and alcohol stores and gambling venues, or is that just like way out of the remit? Yeah, these are going to be random.
Not sure how to answer that one.
Interested.
I could try. Generally, those matters are addressed through council bylaws, which are designed to manage activities within the public space or activities that adversely affect people within it. So loan sharks could be an example of that if they're operating within public areas. In terms of the district plan, we can control land use and we can control subdivision. I have seen the odd instance where specific types of land uses councils have tried to ban, but it hasn't tended to go that well, which is why most councils now go to higher levels of controls, for example, commercial activities, recreation activities, without specifying what particular type of commercial or recreational activity. That tends to be left to other acts which have much more efficient enforcement and monitoring regimes.
So just to clarify, like a liquor store or a pub isn't a permitted activity within a residential zone that would require resource consent. But in addition to that, the off-licence or on-licence are subject to the regulatory functions of the alcohol licensing people within council as well. So that's primarily where the sale or distribution of alcohol is dealt with.
Okay, cool. That's really helpful. Thank you. And is there a way that we could prohibit new service stations or like car yards along arterial routes? And have we done that? Can we?
So in the proposed district plan in all the centres, including the city centre, new yard-based retail, so car yards, aren't permitted. So they're a discretionary activity, and there's direction in the plan that they are not a desirable thing to occur. So, you know, the existing car yards will be operating under their existing use rights, but a new yard-based retail won't go ahead as a permitted activity and would require resource consent to demonstrate why it's an acceptable location at which it's occurring.
Does it cover, so it's the centres, but what about the like arterial routes that connect to those centres? Could we extend it or like make it harder to have car yards along those arterial routes?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think most of our arterials are primarily along the centres, the city centre, and our mixed-use zoning anyway, where those activities aren't envisaged as permitted. In residential areas, as I said, it's not permitted to do any type of commercial activity larger than a home business, and a resource consent would be required as well.
Okay.
The minimum height limits within the central city will also preclude car yard development. If you want to see...
What if they did an apartment development?
So that brings me that brings me to my second point. So if you wish to see what the selling of cars would look like under those rules, the Kia dealership in Taranaki Street, where you have a multi-level car yard, is probably where your rules would take that particular activity.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And the Gordon Wilson Apartments, is there anything we can do to... Are there any conversations going on with Vic? Do they intend to make a submission, and what do they want? Do they want us to... Yeah, what do they want, and how can we incentivise that being turned into some housing rather than a Crown Research Institute?
I'm personally not aware of any at this particular moment. There has been over the years, and of course certainly through the delisting plan change proposal, which of course was unsuccessful in the Environment Court. So yes, it is well, I mean, I've seen the publicity. Currently there are issues around the building and the state of it, but that's been in place for some time now. So the proposed district plan still proposes the current situation because of that Environment Court decision, which is a heritage building, but the rest of the land is up for development by the university if that's what they wish to do.
Okay, cool. And with the Papakainga design guides, is there anything else we can do to like promote or incentivise or enable more Papakainga developments? I'm thinking about Taputeranga and their aspirations for that site, and because the design guides are good, but I don't see like how they make it easier to do those developments in a way that doesn't have to conform to Pākehā regulatory frameworks.
I certainly know for the Taputeranga Marae site, I think we've made a specifically permitted activity, or there's a policy that encourages it for that site. So, you know, certainly we accept that that's something that would make sense there, and that's maybe what they want to do. In terms of encouraging or incentivising elsewhere, to be honest, it's pretty permissive, the plan. I don't really see any issues if someone came along for a residential site that yes, it would need a consent, but the policy framework would support it, and similar for our incentives. Going further and actually helping or incentivising, I think probably again sits outside of the district plan, which is probably what you're asking. But in terms of the district plan, it's enabling for that type of housing to take place. Yeah.
In terms of that... Sorry, you go, you go, Adam.
Talking over each other. I was going to say the framework that is in the plan at the moment has been formed on the advice that we've received from mana whenua partners to date, and they've been comfortable with that framework.
Cool. Presumably, though, given we're doing some work on SNAs, that could be broadened to look at that as like financial incentives.
For Māori.
Yeah. Well, it's a political call, but you know, like there's already some work going on.
You could bring an amendment in the same sort of form to instruct that work.
Yeah. Yep. Well, just like we've got a Built Heritage Incentive Fund, we could have a Papakainga Fund. Yeah.
Yes. In terms of ensuring that the Papakainga design guides are publicised and people are aware, we have just taken on a new iwi RMA senior advisor, Gabriel Kirkwood. That will be part of his work going forward.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. Last one. Yep. On the commissioners, I know this isn't specifically about the district plan, but I kind of have been asking for a while how we're going to make sure that we have representative commissioners on this plan and on the intensified SPP process. So, I mean, what steps have we taken to help upskill people to get that training so that we've got a good range of people reviewing the district plan? Yeah, well, what, 2 people? No, it's not going to be 3, surely not. 5, 7?
Officers?
Because what I'm envisaging is we just have a fund and we will just pay people that fit within certain representations to go and do their training.
Yeah. So we've already offered Ngāti Toa actually from memory, and they just didn't have the bandwidth. So the objective going forward with both our mana whenua partners is to offer training to their staff so that we can get some locally trained mana whenua commissioners. Just in a quick update on our commissioners, we've got a draft list. We haven't contacted any of them yet. We're still searching for more wholesome kind of te ao Māori, Mautanga Māori expertise around the nation. They're very busy at the moment, and we've sent the list of 6 we do have to mana whenua to get their approval or suggest any additional names anyway. So we're including them as part of the commissioner recruitment, if you like, before we bring it back to council for adoption. We've just started that process. The letter went out last week, I think, John.
Okay,
cool.
Just that, yep, sure.
So how many, you did say to me, Liam, that it wouldn't be envisaged to have councillors on these panels, or this panel. Can you explain a little bit more about the numbers you might see on the panel, and would you be using the same panel for both processes, the accelerated and the standard process? And what input councillors might have on the choice of commissioners?
I'll let John answer that. He's been doing some thinking in this space.
I mean, at this stage, it's really a call to be made by yourselves. So we're doing a bit of groundwork around this first round of commissioners. So we have got a list of 6. I suppose what we're thinking, there could be 2 panels, depending on one for the ISPP, the fast track, and one for the first schedule, or there could be one. So it could be one panel, one large panel. So I suppose my own personal preference is perhaps one large panel, and then from that you draw, depending on the hearing, the expertise from that to fit. What we'll also find throughout, I mean, it's going to take over a year or more, the hearings, so we will logically find that some people will drop out or not be available at certain points during that time. Other people have other commitments, so having a large panel is probably our preference at the moment. So that's why 6 is, in our view, is probably not enough at this stage.
You're thinking a panel of 6?
Maybe 10.
Oh, 10.
So that's why we need more
Okay.
people. Yeah.
All right, that's bigger than I had thought. I'd heard. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor Foon.
And yes, so first one is on the 3 waters, and thank you. I think we're doing an amazing job in that department, so that's really exciting coming along, especially around stormwater retention. But just got concerns we've got a gap of actual water retention in dwellings, in the dwellings under 4. And we've become aware that other councils have starting to put in and ask that you must retain either 5 millimetres or 10 millimetres, and this is to achieve to stop environmental degradation and stop water going into the into waterways, and that actually the idea is that you can reuse the water in the house for grey water and toilets and what have you, and then that goes into the stormwater system as opposed into the freshwater system. Our officers, did we get any feedback on that question?
Thank you, Councillor. I've been drafting a response to these questions that you posed, and to try and clarify what the Three Waters provisions are trying to do. And in terms of the smaller developments, what the proposal is that it's about managing flows and volumes. So not just the big storm events, but all rain events, and that would typically be achieved by installing a tank, a rainwater tank that captures the stormwater runoff from the impervious surfaces on your site. And either that water could be either used for other purposes like watering a garden or flushing a toilet or whatever, but you'd need building consent if you were going to use it for flushing toilets because of the Building Act requirements, or it gets slowly released back into the stormwater system. I think in the questions that came through to us, there was a suggestion that the stormwater gets diverted into the wastewater network. I think that would be a very bad idea, given that's exactly what we're trying. We're working actively with Wellington Water to try and stop the cross connections between the wastewater and the stormwater network in order to claw back a bit of capacity in the wastewater network. If we had stormwater going into the wastewater network wouldn't be able to cope, and there would be overflows and broken pipes everywhere. And in terms of the Auckland and Hamilton situation, we've looked at those plans, and our I guess what we're saying is that this is already covered by the requirements that we're proposing around water-sensitive design, and it's deliberately been drafted to provide alternative approaches, so we're not specifying something specific. And I guess a key difference between our Wellington City proposed plan and the Auckland Unitary Plan, for example, is that the Auckland Unitary Plan spells out this metric, and at the moment we don't have any evidence, there's no evidence base in a Wellington City context for that specific metric, whether it be 5 millimetres or 10 millimetres or something different. And in Auckland, they have to look at that requirement on a site-by-site basis to determine whether the achieving the 5 millimetre amount is actually viable, and it depends on the soil conditions and including the degree of compaction of the soil and how quickly the water can go through that. And so I guess we can't just make this up, and it can't just be based on soil maps or a desktop exercise. And in talking to the Auckland planners, it looks like it's not always possible to achieve what that rule is actually requiring in the plan. So it's quite tricky. And I guess at the end of the day, what we're saying is that what we're proposing is trying to achieve the same thing, but being a bit more flexible about how people do that. And we need a lot more evidence to actually have a specific metric like Auckland or Hamilton for our Wellington City context. Yeah.
Okay. Have you got that response coming before the end of today?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. The other one on that was the document that is referred to. Do you think that has got enough in the Wellington water-sensitive urban design for small developments? And so is that something you would see that we might need to update?
So I guess the provisions, the rules are referring to several different documents, and they're all sort of geared around trying to do different things. You're right, that water-sensitive design document is sort of geared to the bigger developments, but there's another document that's referred to for the smaller 1 to 3 units, and that's a document called Managing Stormwater Runoff, the Use of Approved Solutions for Hydraulic Neutrality. That's another Wellington Water guidance document, and it's specifically targeted towards those smaller developments and offering practical solutions on how to achieve stormwater neutrality. But as you've pointed out, these it's a rapidly, technology evolves, right? And things do change, and Wellington Water updates their guidance on a semi-regular basis. They've just done an update to their water services standard, and the other documents are sort of from the 2019-2020 kind of period. So they're relatively new, but yes, they do change. Unfortunately, we are a little bit bound by the Resource Management Act in terms of how the district plan references external documents. So if we're referencing an external document like these Wellington Water standards and guidelines, we have to be specific about the document that we're referring to in order for people to be able to comply. So it has to have the title and the date and the version. Otherwise, it's basically not enforceable. We have enforcement issues. So we're bound by the RMA, and if we want to change the reference in district plan, we have to go through a plan change variation process, unfortunately.
So if Wellington Water update next year and go, here's the new manual, we can't actually, it's not legally binding, the district plan, because we'd have an old document in there.
We'd still be referring to the old document, and we'd have to go through a plan change to update that. I know. It's a foible.
Okay. I'll let Councillor Condi wade in if there's any other questions she has on that one. I've got a few more, though, that I might just go into. Parks and open spaces. I know we discussed this yesterday, but I just wanted to go a bit further. Thank you for your ruling on that. But I guess the question I have is, if parks and open spaces were to become a qualifying matter, what actual benefits would this have over shading and building bulk on a park or open space? So would there be any benefits to it being a qualifying matter?
So if there is a planning response to lower building height adjacent to parks where the NPSUD is telling us to, for example, enable 6 stories. If we're not going to enable that, then that would mean we would have to do a site-by-site analysis to demonstrate as a qualifying matter why that should be the case. We would have to prove and demonstrate what the loss of development capacity would be and what are the impacts of that. In the plan at the moment, the height in relation to boundary control of 5 metres and 60 degrees is proposed to manage building dominance next to open space zoned areas within the high density residential zone. And that would have the effect of pushing building bulk away from those boundaries and would have some effect of ensuring sunlight access into open spaces.
But the question was, if it was a qualifying matter, what difference would that make from the ruling that you've got in the proposed plan at the moment?
So it's not so much if it's a qualifying matter, but what the planning control would be. If the planning control is we're only going to allow 11 metre buildings next to a park, whereas otherwise we had zoned for 21 metres, then there would possibly be a difference there. Also factoring in the height in relation to boundary control. It depends on what the planning response is that we are using if it is a qualifying matter, yes.
Okay. Another question, just around the circular economy, and I'm sorry, I know we've gone over this yesterday, but I just did want to just drill into it more. basically you've said that we don't have certainty on where that would sit in the district plan at this stage, but it could do in the future?
Yes, that is the case, Councillor. Our advice to you for the other members of the working group has been that we would need to do more policy work to understand what the footprint of the circular economy would be within the district plan before those changes could be put into it, and that would probably be best done through a policy investigation that is then translated into the plan through a plan change in the future.
Thank you. And what benefits would, if the Green Network Plan was adopted as a statutory document, what benefits or risks would this have?
So the Green Network Plan couldn't be adopted entire into the district plan as in swallowed whole. What we would have to do is go through the Green Network Plan and pick out those aspects that are amenable to planning controls for implementation. Much of the Green Network Plan is actually to be implemented through the LTP, through Council's direct works on infrastructure and streets.
Great, thank you.
Hang on, we need to finish by 3, and we have got how many more questions?
1.
Well, yeah, sure.
Just once again, I've got a lot of concern around the collision or the crash course that Newtown is on with the intensification rules, MRT, stormwater upgrades, roading use changes, and then the opportunity of that too around, say more public and social housing. What would officers see that there would be a use for an integrated plan for an area such as this when there's going to be so much change in the timing of all that change, and just making sure we maximise the opportunity that is there?
So to address those concerns, an integrated planning mechanism would probably be the best way of doing it. That would bring those concerns into a single touch point for the community. That integrated plan, however, would not be within the district plan. It would be a separate piece of work.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And actually, I want to follow on from that, and Moana, it's good that you're here. I just want to make sure I understand the process properly, because obviously we should have the route for the mass rapid transit, ideally. In a good world, we just obviously haven't been able to marry the processes up. So we will make a decision at the beginning of July about what it is. Does that mean that that can then go to the commissioners to include in it? Or do we have to wait for some time?
The key component of the route is the station locations. That's what allows us to do the upzoning. We won't have those probably for about another 18 months.
Right, so in other words, it will be agreed and then it will have to be a variation?
Yeah.
And in terms of presumably the Public Works Act will be used, which I have some issues with, so how would that process then integrate with the master planning? So the Public Works Act is probably going to be used. So to acquire properties, you will need land. So how will that process work in with the district plan?
What's this on? It may depend on the decision that the council makes also this coming February on a specified development project proposal. If that goes ahead, then that would include the designations and the plan changes, and also the Public Works Act process for land acquisition for works and for infrastructure and for MRT. If that's not proceeded and we use standard processes, then the Public Works Act process would be tied to the notice of requirement and the designation. Let's Get Really Moving is looking at putting through an early notice of requirement to protect the corridor itself, but then there may be another notice for the actual construction further down the track.
Okay, and just following on again from Laurie's question, the master planning could be done as part of that, as part of the notice of requirement, and hopefully some good planning would be done, which would enable heritage to be maintained and new development to happen at the same time.
Again, if we did a development plan under the Urban Development Act and the SDP, then you could incorporate definitely neighbourhood planning into that, because you are bringing in other ministers and other public services and reserves and other benefits for the community into an integrated plan called the development plan. If we went with standard processes, then there would need to be a separate community neighbourhood planning process of some kind that you would try to coordinate as best as you possible with the separate decision processes.
Okay, thank you. Just the last question. It's philosophical. It's the story of my life. This whole thing around the balance between intensification and dealing with the impacts of climate change, that makes me weep. Roll on the reform of the RMA. Are you saying that we have to do one thing at the expense of the other?
You'd appreciate it's a difficult question for an officer to answer. There is ultimately no single strategy is without some form of risk. So if we intensify along the coastlines, then we will exacerbate the risk of climate change. If we don't intensify at all, we will exacerbate the risk of climate change through increased emissions from spread out development. Essentially, within your roles of governors, there will be a trade-off at some point, and ultimately it's up to yourselves to work out the quantum of what the city will bear.
Actually, Sean, I think it's the planet who's got the carrying capacity, not councillors. But anyway, we will leave that to Thursday. Great. Okay, so if we can just deal with this advice from MFE that we've got. It's a bit technical, but people need to understand. Oh, sorry, Jill. Sorry, I didn't see. Apologies.
All good. I just want to follow up on Councillor Foon's questions about the grey water use, because I think there might be a little bit of a misunderstanding that the recommendation was that we were wanting to put stormwater into wastewater. I think the inference is that you use the stormwater and it becomes wastewater because it's gone through your shower or your toilet or a washing machine. So I don't think that was quite what it was meaning, but I guess also I'm interested in the fact that maybe we don't have the evidence to say that at a lower level that we can make it work. But I am interested in the fact that our drinking water system, whilst at the moment we're not in a crisis as far as drinking water supply, we are working quite close to our means on that one, and that actually these two things do connect up. That if we have more people in the city using grey water for the things that you don't need drinking water for, then that has to have good outcomes for our drinking water supply in the long term. So are we able to draw those things together in any way to achieve what Councillor Foon was talking about? I do have an amendment that's around incentivising and some work that could be done for the next long-term plan, but I am interested to see if there's anything that can be done around the district plan for that. Can they be brought together?
Thanks, Councillor. I guess, as we've sort of talked about previously, what we have proposed in terms of the Three Waters provisions is not prescribing the reuse of stormwater for flushing toilets and things like that, but it doesn't preclude it either. So that could form part of a person's development proposal. The rules certainly don't stop that from happening. I was going to say something else, but it's gone from my little brain.
While you're thinking about that, what would it cost a developer to, I guess, do a grey water use system? What would there be an over and above cost? What would be the quantum for that? I guess it depends on the size development, but
yes, it would. There'd be a cost in terms of the building consent process and the plumbing and stuff like that, but I don't have a particular figure. I could try and find out, but I'm not. Yeah. It
would be interesting to know what the consenting difference was, I guess. But I mean, that might lead into Sean has helped me sort of figure out an amendment around some incentivising, but whether we could do something that helped with that extra cost of doing, the consenting part of that or something would be potentially helpful.
I've just remembered what the other thing I was going to say was. Because this Wellington Water have been working closely with us on the development of this Three Waters stuff, and I checked in with them yesterday around incentivising stormwater reuse, and apparently they have scoped a piece of work already that would help address the questions that you've asked, but it's not been activated, and it's probably not a huge priority for them at the moment, but they have done some scoping of it, so I guess we could advocate that it happened. Yeah.
That would be quite interesting to connect in with that other part, Sean, just to see if we can connect that up, because it probably is a political decision about whether that's important to us as a city to be thinking about how we're using our water better. So be interested in that. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Jenny. Last question.
Thank you. Just trying to follow up again on this Three Water stuff. I guess where we were coming from, and I've just gone back and looked at the actual policies and whatnot that are in the plan, and it talks about at or below modelled peak flow and volume. And I think a lot of what it comes back to is, what do we mean by peak flow and volume? Because managing peak flows is really, really important from a flood management standpoint, because we want to, as we've talked about with, you want to flatten the curve, just like we've tried to do with COVID. You want to flatten the peak flow and you stretch the flooding out over a longer period of time so that you don't get these flooding issues. But from an environmental standpoint, actually, that can be bad for the stream. And really the environmental point of view is that actually it's this initial rainfall depth every time it rains that's important, not necessarily the peak flow and volume. So that's where we understood that there was kind of a gap where we've got peak flows, we're looking at peak flows, but we aren't necessarily, there might be a co-benefit that we also happen to be addressing issues around initial rainfall depth. But the plan isn't designed to do that, and that's really where Councillor Foon and I are coming from. So can you talk a bit about that, about the what do we mean by peak flow and modelled peak flow and volume, and how does that compare to initial rainfall depth?
As I was saying, Wellington Water are really the experts in this field, particularly modelling, and I wouldn't like to try and answer that question off the bat now, but they do have some really good guidance that's on their website that is actually quite readable and is very helpful.
So, Sherilyn, I think I'm getting some feedback from a colleague. It is quite technical. Maybe if you take that offline, and then if there's anything you need to report back to us. I think, good question, Jenny. But it is quite complex, and we do need to...
I acknowledge it's very technical, but it's also very, very important. So
Absolutely. So we look forward to your hearing the outcome of your discussion with officers. That's good. Thank you. Right. So we just do need to finish off on this last issue. Yep, the MFE advice.
Cool. So speaking of technical, here we go. Here's a technical amendment that we're proposing to make to the proposed district plan. So just a bit of background here. Our current residential zones currently contain some exemptions for small things to breach rules. So for instance, where you're putting a solar panel under 0.5 metre high on a roof and it breaches the height limit, it doesn't trigger the need for resource consent. So this is to cover small things with minor effects. So satellite dishes, antenna, aerials, chimneys, flagpoles, architectural features, eaves, things like that that are quite small, and it doesn't really matter that they breach the rules, or for instance with solar panels, it makes sense, we want to enable them. So these are in the current plan. We carried these exemptions over into the proposed district plan. So for our new MDRS standards, the 3x3, we included these exemptions because it's current practice. We thought it was a sound and robust thing to do. MFE have very kindly reviewed our plan for us and provided some advice to say that these are things that go beyond the scope of the MDRS. So they are changing the normal standards beyond what we are allowed to do. So effectively, if we include these in the plan, then we make our MDRS standards not defunct, but they don't have legal effect. So it would mean, sorry. So what we have to do is remove these breaches from the MDRS and then reintroduce them into the plan through the course of the submissions process. So for our residential zones only, we are changing some exemptions to the height and recession plane and boundary setback and coverage standards. That change is removing the exemptions for solar panels and chimneys and flagpoles. By doing that, the MDRS do have legal effect, but we still think it's important to bring these things back in because they're pragmatic and normal, and therefore we will reintroduce them back through the submission and hearing process. So they will come back into the plan through the decision, but at the proposed district plan will be amended to remove these breaches on the advice of MFE. That was hopefully plain, but I don't think it was.
It is a bit complex. Is that a complete list?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We can actually share the actual changes. Yeah.
So Councillor Calvert, then Councillor Freed.
It's not so much about things on the list, but just tell me about the process. So you have to make it. You're planning on making a submission to as part. So you're not proposing to do it now, but make a separate
sorry.
submission.
We will make the change before the proposed plan is notified to amend these standards. But through the submission and hearing process, we will want to reintroduce these exemptions back into the plan. But we have to do it like that because we can't just include them in the plan right from the start.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Freed.
Yeah, so some of these things might not be so minor as they seem. So I'm just actually wondering how the eaves up to 600 millimetres is minor when we're now talking about, a metre between boundaries and, much tighter measurements. So are they actually still minor?
So we're actually increasing the yards as a result of the MDRS. So the yards are actually... So at the moment, our current plan doesn't have a specific side yard requirement. It has a requirement for a metre setback down a side boundary or a metre separation. So the MDRS are actually increasing the yard setbacks from what's in the current plan. And what the eaves allows you to do is effectively the eaves can protrude into that side yard, and it's just that end of the eave can go within the 1.5 metres. Yeah.
And architectural features seems a bit vague. What's meant by that?
Yeah, there isn't a definition, so that is up to discretion of the resource consents team, but that is in the current plan. I think finials is, a term that's is an architectural feature. I've had this before where someone has proposed something that clearly isn't an architectural feature and you say, no, go away. In other words, it's not defined, but if someone tries to bend the rules, you can say, no, that doesn't come under that exemption.
Is there anything else we're going to be making a submission on to commissioners? It is a bit odd. That's it.
Well, not that we're aware of at the moment, but there may be one or two things that come along as it's very common for council to put a submission in on their own plan because things get picked up. And, the business units come to us and say, oh, you haven't taken this into account. Can you please make a change? So it's quite common practice.
So just again, from a process point of view, if councillors were also through community feedback were picking up problems, what's the process for the council to pick them up if they're not too political? I mean, obviously people could bring them up themselves, but...
So anyone can make a submission on the proposed district plan, so that could be organisations, community groups or individuals.
I'm aware of that, but what if there's something which shouldn't be contentious, which would be good to have the council support on?
I really don't think we can make a call like that, because once it's out in the public arena, if it needs to be changed, they should make a submission, or they could even alert us and we could put it in our submission. But there needs to be a submission process to make sure we maintain the integrity.
I'm obviously not being precise enough. So if we did want council to pick it up, and so do they just send a note to officers? I'm talking about small technical things, not major.
Yep, certainly that's possible. Yep.
Okay, it's an interesting process. All right, is that clear as mud to people? No. Do you want to ask any further questions? Okay, and like just with the solar panels, it's not going to slow us down on things like this for a year?
I think when we looked at this, it's probably only going to be maybe a dozen applications that would be impacted anyway, and that would be stretching it. So, because if you recall, the Minister has to make the call by November 2023, and in this particular MDRS need to be active by August this year, right? I think is the window, and so in terms of MFE's advice to us, it's like you're probably better to remove it and include it as part of the submission process. But it is really just the legislation driving this particular nuance.
Okay. All right, people clear? All right, so we'll close now. Just a reminder to get any amendments in, and we look forward, Councillor Condi, to hearing back on your question. Don't want to interrupt anyone. It will be interesting to hear, and I'm sure there will be an amendment coming. Thank you very much for all your hard work. Much appreciated. All right, thank you.